Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by GoCollect. And if you're interested, head over to Regie Collects here on YouTube. Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector and the host of the GoCollect speculation video, and I want to welcome you to another episode. In this episode, we are going to take some time to talk about several blog posts that touch on a host of different topics. We'll start out with a little bit of MCU spec, talk about some indie comics. We'll segue into Silver Age comics and also talk about Golden Age. Put another way, there is a little something for everybody in this one. We've actually known for quite some time that Kang the Conqueror is going to be in the upcoming Ant-Man movie. But for some reason or another, it has been pretty radio silent when it comes to this movie and also Kang the Conqueror. And I'm honestly not sure why. But in this first blog post, our blogger does a pretty solid job of connecting a few different dots out there and suggesting that now might be the time to pick up a Kang the Conqueror related book that has been overlooked. When a lot of people think about Kang the Conqueror, they primarily think about two books, and I am specifically talking about Fantastic Four issue number 19 as well as Avengers issue number 8. But in this blog post, the blogger is actually connecting both Kang the Conqueror and the Inhumans, and again is pointing out a book that folks may want to pick up. And he is specifically talking about Uncanny Inhumans issue number 2. And in this book and in this story arc, you essentially get a wonderful Kang the Conqueror story as well as his connection to the Inhumans. And in the words of the blogger, this book is ridiculously undervalued right now. And at present, this book can actually be picked up at a 9.8 for as little as $34. So if you believe that there is some magic to be made with Kang the Conqueror and also with the Inhumans, this might be a book that you want to check out. I would encourage you to read this blog post linked down in the description in its entirety and then decide for yourself if this is something that you want to pursue. If you've been paying attention, you know that indie publishers are absolutely killing it right now. And I'm specifically talking about indies like Boom Studios and also Bad Idea. And if you believe that Image is also an indie publisher, then we lump them in there. And definitely all of the aforementioned are doing some incredible work right now. And in this blog post, the blogger does a really solid job of highlighting several different titles from these publishers that you may want to keep your eye on. And the premise here is that these publishers are, one, making some really awesome comic book properties, but that they have small print runs, and they also, the publishers that is, have these relationships with media outlets like Netflix and Amazon Prime that could result in some of these titles making it to the small screen. And again, if you think back about things like Lock and Key, Umbrella Academy, and even The Boys, it makes perfect sense. And I'm not going to talk about every single title that the blogger highlights in this post, but I will highlight a few for you that I personally enjoy and you might also enjoy as well. The very first one that I want to talk about is Geiger. And Geiger issue number 1 was recently released. It is an awesome read. And it is a mixture of like a post-apocalyptic type of thing with the tear-jerker family element. Thoroughly enjoyed this book, and if you haven't picked it up, I definitely want to encourage you to check it out. It is worth the read. The second book that I want to highlight for you that the blogger spoke about is Berserker issue number 1, and this Keanu Reeves inspired written type of book is just fantastic. And Boom is making magic happen with these foil covers and multiple print runs and that kind of stuff. And it is honestly, again, just a really great book that has already been optioned for, I believe, a movie and also an anime. And that's also something that has been highlighted here on the channel as well. So that's a second one that you definitely want to check out. And then the last one that I want to talk about is actually from Bad Idea. And I'm specifically talking about ENIAC. ENIAC issue number 1 and 2 are just great reads. It is about a computer system that is just taking over. And this one is, again, a great comic that could make the leap to the small screen. So again, just three books that are coming out from these indie publishers that are incredible, that are a fun read, but then might also be worth a little something because of the fact that they're really solid, the print runs are small, and then there is the potential for some magic to get made on the small screen. I definitely want to encourage you to check out this blog post. It is linked down in the description. So a few seconds ago, I made mention of Berserker. And with that book, they actually released some really awesome foil variant covers that were reminiscent of the 90s. And as a collector from the 90s, I had to pick up several copies. But I make mention of it again because in this next blog post, our blogger spends some time talking about another gimmick from the 90s, specifically 1993 with a hologram cover. But not just any holographic cover, we are talking about a print error variant, specifically with Wolverine issue number 75. There are basically two versions of this comic out there. There is a regular green holographic cover, and then there is a blue error variant. And the blogger in this blog post basically does a comparison of these two books. Now, here's what's really cool about this comic. It is significant because in this issue, we actually learn that Wolverine's bones are part of his anatomy. And I think we see his bone claws for the very first time. So if you're a Wolverine fan, this is a pretty cool book. But digging into some of the data, what the blogger does is looks at the value of a 9.8 for both the regular holographic cover and the print error variant. And what we see at a 9.8 for the regular cover is that this book is selling for roughly $117 and has a positive year-to-date return of about 6.1%. When you look at some of the more recent sales data since this article was published, we see that there have been some sales of around $80 and there have been 325 sales. Now, this is important because when you look at the error variant, what you see is some very different numbers. At a 9.8, the error variant sold earlier this year for $1,130, and it had a negative return year to date of about 70%. Now, when you look at some of the more recent sales data, what you see is that this book has actually been selling for around $350. So a nice fall off in this book, still well above the regular cover, but not as high as that high water mark of $1,130. Now, this is really cool. If you, again, happen to be a Wolverine fan or you're, nostalgic about 90 era holographic covers, or you're into error variants, this could be a really cool book for you to look into and decide whether you want to pick up and add to your collection. This blog post is linked down in the description. Give it a read. This next blog post is pretty solid, and it's solid because it is offering up some awesome practical tips for people to consider and think about whether they actually make sense for them. One of the biggest tips that is offered in this post is that people might want to think about picking up DC Silver Age keys. And the premise behind this is that everyone, by and large, is focused on Marvel Silver Age keys. And because everyone is focused on Marvel, that means that people aren't necessarily paying attention to DC Comics. And it's a really awesome concept here because when you dig into some of the data, what you see is that Marvel Silver Age keys are actually up roughly 35%, while DC Silver Age comics are down roughly 35%. And so this represents a really wonderful buying opportunity where if you believe that there is some potential for these DC books, then you might actually see a really wonderful return by picking these books up now and riding the wave into the future. The blogger goes on to offer up some practical tips, again, for you to consider to maybe even get these books a little less expensive than the 35% that I mentioned just a few seconds ago. This next blog post honestly gives me a little FOMO, the fear of missing out. And I say that because at some point, I am going to make my way into Golden Age comics, and I just haven't yet. But this blog post is very much focused on Golden Age comics and 3 Golden Age creators that we should all be aware of because they did some amazing work back in the day. And the very first artist that the blogger talks about is Alex Schomburg, an incredibly talented individual that has done some of my favorite covers featuring the Submariner and the Human Torch. And at some point, I'm actually going to pick up some of these books. Fingers crossed that I'll be able to do it. But Alex Schomburg is one of those quintessential artists that is widely known by and large and incredibly well respected because of his artistic talent. And the blogger does a really awesome job of telling us who Alex Schomburg is and also describing why his work is significant. One of the other creators that I want to highlight for you is Matt Baker. And Matt Baker actually passed away in the early 60s, but he was the first African-American artist to garner financial success as a comic book artist. And one of his more famous pieces is Phantom Lady issue number 17. And he is, again, incredibly talented. A lot of his work is unfortunately out of the price range of a lot of people, but the blogger does a really good job of highlighting where and how folks might be able to pick up some of his work that is less expensive. And I'm not going to tell you who the third artist is. I want to encourage you to read this blog post so that you can discover who this artist is for yourself and also read about the other 2 that I did mention. So there you have it. We have reached the end of another recap. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there was a little something for everyone in this one. And if you enjoyed this episode, I definitely want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button, leave a comment behind so we can mix it up in the comment section. And if you're feeling frisky, tune in next week when we get to do this all over again.